Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at www.audibletrial.com/historyfangirl. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Kindle, Android, or MP3 player. Hi, I'm Stephanie Craig. Welcome to the History Fangirl podcast. This is episode 8, The Acropolis and the Golden Age of Athens. Last year, I spent a month in Athens exploring the ancient Greek sites of the city and the surrounding area. I saw many beautiful and inspiring ancient sites, but the Acropolis stands alone as one of the most important and influential ancient buildings in world history. How did this plateau become the architectural marvel of the world? How did the vision of one man, Pericles, come to leave such a remarkable stamp on the image of ancient Greece abroad? And what happened in the centuries between the rise of classical Greece and the emergence of a modern Greek nation? As outsiders fought to control the region, how did these buildings survive, and what happened to their treasures? My guest today is Ryan Stitt, the host and creator of the History of Ancient Greek podcast. We discuss the history of the Acropolis, how Pericles changed it forever, and its legacy after the fall of ancient Athens. At the end of this episode, find out how to enter this week's contest. All right. Well, I want to introduce my guest for today. Ryan Stitt is the host and creator of the History of Ancient Greece podcast. Welcome, Ryan.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no problem. So I met you in the way that people meet people these days, which I met you in the internet Facebook group about history podcast lovers. And then I checked out your podcast, and it's amazing. So I'm so glad that the world is so different than it was 10 years ago.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I know a lot of people in the history podcast realm that I hope one day to finally meet. It's the internet is a wonderful thing.
Yeah, I feel like I have a lot of friends, and I have a lot of people that I look up to that I don't know in person, and I do hope I get to meet them in person. But at least you get to connect. And I was in Alabama this morning. I just got back to Bulgaria this afternoon. You're in Texas, but we can talk about history. So I love the way the world works now. So thank you for agreeing to come on.
Oh, you're welcome. And I used to live in Alabama, so.
Yeah, which is crazy. So why don't you tell our listeners how a guy who's living in West Texas, who used to live in Alabama, got interested in running a podcast about ancient Greek history, because it's one of your loves.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I'm originally from Pennsylvania. I went to undergrad at the University of Alabama. I didn't really know much at all about ancient history till I got there. I took a myth class. I really loved it. I discovered iTunes U back then. At that point, this would have been about 2008. iTunes U had a bunch of cool courses that I listened to. Greek History by Donald Kagan was the one that got me super interested. So I read that, and then I read Herodotus. So I took a few history courses, fell in love with it, discovered Mike Duncan's podcast, The History of Rome. I ultimately studied abroad in Greece and Italy, changed my field of study, and went to graduate school for classics, ultimately left. But I loved podcasts ever since, and I always thought that someone would come up with Greek, like a Greek history podcast, just like the history of Rome, and it never happened. So after several years of waiting for it to happen, I decided, well, if I can't find what I want, I might as well make it.
That's funny, because this show is like, there are other interview shows out there. They just didn't have the topics that I wanted. So you were just like, I have to do this whole in-depth topic that I care about based on other people doing similar things. That's awesome.
Yeah. When I left graduate school and I worked in the civilian world before I ultimately joined the Air Force, which is why I'm in Texas, I kept with my passion of Greek history. And one of the ways I was doing that was, embarrassingly, I guess, I used to write out these podcast episodes, but I didn't really have the courage to make it myself. So I just someone will come along and make it. I don't have to do this. I didn't think anybody actually would listen to me. Lo and behold, I was completely wrong. Way more popular than I ever imagined, which is a good sign. That just means that there is a thirst for learning about Greek history in unconventional ways. I was a product of unconventional education myself. The least I can do is push that forward on other people and help them come to not necessarily come to the passion that I have for this subject, but enrich their knowledge of it in some way. Or at the very least, maybe a few people will leave with their lives changed the way I was left after listening to history podcasts. So
Yeah, I mean, my life was changed by history podcast too. In like a weird way, it made me start traveling. For me, and this is probably similar for you. You know how people will say like, I don't need to study math because I'm never going to use math, or you're never going to use algebra in real life, and that's like an excuse. And for me, it's like I loved history so much, and I studied it so much. I'm Facebook friends with like my favorite history teachers still to this day. We'll talk to them, and for me, it's like, if you're not going to use your history, what's the point? But not so much that it had been a waste, but I better start using my history other than just to like inform my opinion about current events. I needed to start using it. So I love being able to go out and see these places. And you got to study abroad in Greece, and you got to do some really cool stuff while you were there that regular tourists don't get to do. Why don't you tell a little bit about your experience in Greece, and then we'll start talking about the topic for today, which is the Acropolis.
Yes. So I was there twice. The first time I went was in 2010, I guess it was the summer. That was the first time I studied abroad. I did like, my university had this, I guess it would have been like 24-day tour where you kind of just traveled around from a museum to archaeological sites, staying in coach buses and hotels, and just traveling around the country of Greece, and island hopped a little bit. You're in like a different place every day. After I left that, I was like, oh man, I really love this sort of stuff. Like I took as many archaeology classes, and I started learning ancient Greek as soon as I got back. This was in the summer before my junior year of undergrad. So I really liked that. So I got to go to places like Santorini, Athens, Olympia, Delphi, Thessaloniki, Corinth, Mycenae, the big places. But I didn't get to see everything because it was only 24 days. And especially in Athens, we were there for like 3 days or like 2.5 days, and we were out of there because they didn't want us. They didn't want us to be there super long.
Yeah.
A, to see other things, and B, it was like right in the middle of the very first demonstrations that were happening back in 2010.
Okay.
So we kind of just like saw the big highlights and got in and out because, not that it was dangerous, but we were a university that had to safeguard. So then 2011 was coming about, and I actually was graduating early by taking a full summer course, and I decided I wanted to study abroad because I had extra classes to take, and I was going to go to Egypt actually. Oh. And I was all signed up to go to Egypt. I was supposed to get there in May, and then May 2011, what happened then, the Arab Spring. So we weren't allowed to go to Cairo. I wasn't allowed to show up, obviously. So I had to find a program last minute, and I found this program through Arcadia University. It was I spent a month in Athens, a month in Rome, and a month in Syracuse on Sicily. As a student there, I was taking archaeology classes. So that was really cool. So I got to spend a month in Athens. I traveled on the weekends to various sites, but I got to see the city of Athens in way more detail than I had before. I visited all the museums. I got to go see all the little different districts and all that sort of stuff. I even got to go to Crete on a ferry trip that weekend, which I didn't get to go beforehand. Sadly, I didn't get to see Acropolis because it was still closed. I need to go back. I'm planning on it next year now that it's open. That's one of the main things I still have not seen yet, and it's bugging me because I really want to see it.
Well, let me know if you go, and I might go too. I use a list called the Traveler Century Club list when I talk about how many countries I've been to, because it breaks up some countries into more distinct regions. Like Palestine it might be politically part of Israel, or it might not be, depending on your perspective, but it's definitely going to a different country. Mm-hmm. And Crete is so far away from mainland Greece that it is actually its own place. And I have a friend who's house sitting on the island of Rhodes for 3 months. She got a really good situation trying to help them with tourism, because they've been some of the Greek islands have been really badly hit between the economic downturn that's hurt Greece. It obviously hurt the world, but it hurt Greece. Mm-hmm. But combined with the British pound being hit really hard, and so many British tourists being the primary visitors to Greek islands over mainland Europeans, and those businesses getting paid in pounds, Greek tourism is hurting and needs people to go to the islands. So anyone who can go to the islands should go. If you need an excuse to go to the Greek islands, you should go now.
I can imagine the refugee crisis is dampening on certain islands too.
Oh yeah, because people also feel danger.
Yeah.
I mean, it may not be dangerous, but the
perception.
And most islands, yeah, exactly. But also, if your business gets paid in pounds and all of a sudden the pound is worth 30% less, there's nothing you can do about those contracts you already signed. So everyone should just go hang out on a Greek island next summer.
I don't know if that's bothering Crete so much though, because I remember reading an article a few months ago that there were lines just wrapped around Knossos. For people to get in. So I don't know how it might be affecting the lesser known areas, but I'm imagining Santorini and Mykonos and Knossos are still very popular destinations.
Oh yeah, Santorini's never going to be hurting. I don't know specifically about Greece, but I know or about Crete, but I know for like Rhodes and the small islands that people stay in around there
Mhm.
and then travel over, that they need people.
Yeah.
So people should just go Greek island hop.
When I went to Crete, it was pretty. I think it's like the Still, but you'd have to check. I left on a Friday night, and the only ferry that left from Athens to Crete was at 10 p.m. at night, and it was an 8-hour ferry. So basically, I just slept on it, and I got off at 6 a.m. I got breakfast somewhere, and I threw some water on my face and like kind of woke myself up, brushed my teeth where I could find it, and then I took a bus to Knossos, and I got there at 8 o'clock, or I got there before 8 o'clock before it opened, so I beat all of the tourists because that place gets busy fast. And then I left on Sunday, and I had to be back in class for Monday morning, so I left Sunday night and slept, and then basically caught the metro to class. I arrived at 6 and made it back before class started at 8. So it was basically a long weekend. But I mean, I didn't have to I only paid to stay one night. That would have been Saturday night. I slept 2 of the nights on the ferry. I think that's the way it still is now, since it's an 8-hour thing, it's mostly overnight sort of thing.
Yeah, and they have a lot of cheap flights now, but they're not going to get you out of your hotel room.
Yeah, exactly. So that was fine for me. Yeah, when I was there, I got to see Knossos, and then I want to go back to, because the new museum is supposed to be really cool on Heraclio. The new like redesigned museum. I was there, I was there in 2011, so it was the older version. So they're supposed to have like way more stuff out because they have way more room to put things. So.
Oh, gotcha. Oh, that's awesome. So let's talk a little bit about the Acropolis. So the way that we picked today's topic was, it was kind of like, where have you been in Greece and where have I been in Greece that overlap? So I spent a month, because you're an expert on so many of the places and can talk about the cultural impact of so many of the places, that it was kind of like, well, let's see what poor Stephanie is limited to. And I was in Greece for October of last year. So I basically was there for the whole month of October. And I went to the Acropolis twice. The first time, I just went and did all the tourist stuff. And the second time I went was a national holiday. And in Greece, if you're in Greece on a national holiday, you can go to a lot of the places for free. So I was able to go back to the Archaeology Museum and go back up the Acropolis for free, which is cool because combined that's like 40 euros worth of stuff you don't want to pay to do again. And the Acropolis it's one of the most touristed places in the world. And a lot of the stuff that used to be there isn't there anymore. And it still is so powerful because the architecture, the climb to get up there, everything you know about classical Greek history is kind of centered around this place. It's still like just an amazing experience, even though it really is stripped in so many ways of like all of the frescoes and the color and the friezes and everything. So why don't we talk a little bit about what the Acropolis was like in the early days of Greek culture before it became what we think of it as?
Well, we know from archaeological evidence from the Neolithic age that there was a settlement there, I think as early as 6000 BC-ish. There was a Bronze Age settlement there as well. It's attested in Homer as well as archaeologically. The Acropolis, as we know it, became the center of the city, became the religious center. There was a sanctuary there to Athena, Poseidon, a bunch of other cults. I mean, you have the myth where Athena and Poseidon fought over the patronage of the city. That started in the archaic period. There was a temple to Athena up there that got burnt by the Persians. So what we see now is part of the classical age of Greece. Everything that was on there from the archaic period got completely destroyed when the Persians took over the city, when the Athenians evacuated Salamis during the wars, and they just ransacked it. We do have a lot of the statues that were still from that period because they just they got destroyed and then they fell underneath. And then following the war, the Athenians, they swore an oath that they wouldn't rebuild until the Persian threat was diminished or they got rid of it, basically covered everything up, which is great for archaeologists because we found so many like broken statues that we were able to put together that are now in the Acropolis Museum, which is great. It's like a gold mine for archaeologists. It wasn't until 449 BC when they finally started to rebuild on on the Acropolis, and that's when they started with the famous Periclean building program. They had the Parthenon, the Erechtheion, the Propylaea, the Temple of Athena Nike, and then also had the Temple of Hephaestus in the Agora, or the Agora, sorry. The Periclean building program is basically what you see today. Plus, I mean, obviously you have later Hellenistic and Roman changes to it as well. But like when Greece got its independence later, we can go into this more, but they kind of stripped away a lot of the Byzantine and Ottoman and a lot of the modern things that built up around the Acropolis and tried to bring it back down to the classical level. So what you see now is basically what happened, or what it was like at the Peloponnesian War.
So the Acropolis is this giant plateau in the middle of Athens. You can see it from almost everywhere, which makes it this wonderfully safe place to fortify. So even throughout the centuries, Ottomans built things on there, Venetians built things on there, Byzantines built things on there. And when they would build them, they would just take these beautiful structures that were already there, like the Propylaea, and just add stuff to it because they didn't knock them down. We're very lucky that they just changed them instead of knocking them down. But how did modern Greece decide what they wanted the Acropolis to look like now? Like, how did they decide this was the heyday and everything else is junk on top of it? Because to me, like, I've traveled just to see Venetian works of defense, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Like, something the Venetians built, to me, is just as historic, if maybe not as ancient, as something built by the ancient Greeks.
When they had their independence from the Ottomans, I think it was part of the whole nationalism. I don't want to say nationalism in like a negative tone, but like they got their independence. It was sort of that whole, we're going to harken back to ancient Greece, like the time we were independent before we started being conquered by other people, sort of thing, before we were Roman, before we were Byzantine, before we were under the Latin League, before we were Venetians, before we were under the Turks, all that sort of stuff. It was during that time of nationalistic fervor. So it was take it back to Greece's glory days and promote this one great civilization as we move forward with our independence.
So part of why we think of what is the heyday of classical Greece as the heyday of classical Greece is because modern Greeks identify with it, or have chosen to make it the thing that they identify with the most in terms of their national identity. So it's just as tied up in like modern Greek history as it is in ancient Greek history.
Yeah, I mean, and tourism is a huge part of their economy even still today. They're extremely proud of their past, so it's part of their identity. I'm from America. We're not that ancient. We're actually relatively young compared to other countries. So I couldn't imagine I can't imagine what it would be like growing up in a country where there's I just couldn't imagine that growing up.
Yeah, I love that about this part of the world. So you get that in Greece, you get that in Bulgaria, pretty much all over the Balkan Peninsula, and people can quibble about whether or not mainland Greece is part of the Balkans, but if you look at a map, it's on the Balkan Peninsula. Because people have lived here for 6,000, 8,000 years in some cities. So it's like, how do you build a modern city without destroying something that's 6,000 years old? Because everywhere is full of stuff that's 6,000 years old. And Greece does a really good job, especially the Acropolis metro stop, of incorporating the ancient things that they have found underground and remind you that you're kind of at the level that a lot of ancient Greece was at when you're in the subway.
Definitely. Same thing in Thessaloniki too. Recently they were building a metro subway and they came across a lot of finds. It's just fascinating to me.
So when I was in Athens, I had a friend who runs a shop, and part of living in modern Greece with the modern Greek economy is that so many of the jobs are service industry jobs where you maybe get one day off a week, or maybe you don't even get that. Living in modern Greece, it seems like you're surrounded constantly by beautiful, amazing history, but the modern Greek economy is a hard one to make a living in. And his father, who had run the shop for most of his life, had seen the Acropolis and literally never been up there because it's his heritage. So why would he need to go up and see it? So that just blew my mind. Like, it's his, he owns it. He feels so proud about it. And that means he has no need to climb up all the steps to go see it.
Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, I guess America is much bigger, so we don't get the opportunity to see a lot of things, but I guess it's kind of the similar. There are a lot of people in America who don't actually go see our national monuments or go see things that are right there in our backyard, and they could get there if they wanted to. So I guess maybe that's similar. I don't know, but that does blow my mind that he has never been to the Acropolis and he lives right there in Athens.
It's like he's so proud of it, but he doesn't need to go up there. So let's talk a little bit about the actual classical building period of Pericles. So, what sparked the building craze? And why don't you tell us a little bit about how that got started and maybe a little bit about what we know about Pericles?
All right. So, like I said, the Acropolis was sacked in 480, 479 BC over the winter, and then in the spring again because the Persians occupied it twice. They, when they sacked it, and after the Greeks won the war, they made the Oath of Plataea. They swore that they wouldn't rebuild any of the temples until the Persian threat was removed. And then, so in the peace finally came in around 449 or 450, 449 BC with Persians. There's some quibble whether it was an actual peace or if it was just a de facto peace, an unofficial one. Regardless, there was peace with Persia at this point for a whole litany of reasons, but we won't go into that. 30 years afterwards, after the wars, peace was at least temporary. The Greeks and the Persians would have issues later down the road again. And at that point, Athens was well into the swing of things. With its imperial empire, Pericles was firmly in control of the government, not from an official position. I mean, he was the strategos, meaning he was one of the generals, but he held the democracy basically in the palm of his hand. Like he knew the right strings to pull to get the people to do exactly what he wanted. He was a very good orator. He was a charismatic leader. He was a demagogue, basically. But he also knew, kind of like Augustus did with the Romans, he also knew how to placate both sides. He knew how to get people to do what he wanted. He knew how to present himself. I mean, there were people who disliked him and there were issues, but he was the man. So with the empire, with the Delian League, they basically turned what were donations in order for their defense against Persia after there was no need for Persian anymore. And this, you can go into a whole litany about this. It ended up becoming a slush fund for the Athenians. So they ended up using it to build up their cities. And he put a lot of this money towards rebuilding the temples that had been burnt by the Persians. And so that's where we get the whole Periclean building program. It's you can see in Plutarch in his Life of Pericles, he tells all about, he gives a vivid description of it, about the enthusiasm and energy that went into it by the people. I mean, in another sense, if you're out constantly fighting against the Persians and then all of a sudden you are at peace, and I mean, not that they would be at peace for long because they would have to deal with the Spartans here soon, but like you had a lot of people who you had to employ somewhere to do something to keep them happy. So they ended up having a lot of workers that they could use. I did mention that Pericles had some enemies. He was accused of tricking Athens out with jewelry, like it was some high price at Tyra, which is a courtesan. So there were conservatives who didn't like what was going on, but the people, for all intents and purposes, loved it. He beautified the city. Phidias was his chief, the person in charge of the sculptural design. He was in charge of the main sculptures. He wasn't actually the one who sculpted the main sculptures in the Parthenon, but he was the one who oversaw it. He did the famous statues. And then they had the architects. He employed some of the best sculptors, artists, architects of the time to come in there and work on them. So what was the second part of your question?
Oh, what do we know about Pericles the man?
So his dad was Xanthippus, and he was a general during the Persian Wars, and he ended up dying shortly thereafter. He was a staunch conservative in a sense, but Pericles had different politics, most like a lot of their parents, actually. He ended up being a very close. Pericles was kind of influenced by Themistocles, who was a maverick. He was one of the very first populists in Athens. He wasn't poor. He was from the non-traditional elite who raised himself up by his bootstraps, so to speak. And Pericles was influenced by him. He was also influenced by Ephialtes, who, when they brought about the radical democracy, he was his junior. Ephialtes was a little bit older. And when they brought about changes to the democracy that radicalized a little bit more, and especially in terms of the Areopagus, Ephialtes mysteriously was murdered, which coincidentally enough would be the only political assassination that we have on record in the Athenian democracy. So instead of Pericles after that, I mean, there are some theories that Pericles did him off so he could get rid of his partner, but whatever. That I don't put much stake into that. Anyway, Pericles stepped in, and this was 461. The other conservative politician at the time, Cimon, we got him ostracized, and Pericles basically was the man in Athens at that point, going forward. And they had a little skirmish. I don't want to say little skirmish. They had the undeclared First Peloponnesian War with the Peloponnesians. Sparta was slightly involved in that, but not too much. It was mainly with the Corinthians and Megarians and whatnot. And then it was after that where he finally controlled the policies during that whole time. He was in control of the policies that led ultimately into the Peloponnesian War. It was his death in 429 during the plague that hit Athens and destroyed a lot of their population. He died along with it, and then the Athenians kind of sputtered a little bit in the war for a few years after that. And some will argue that they didn't have any other generals. The main reason they lost is they lacked the leadership. That if Pericles would have been there the whole time, they might have came out differently. But they lacked vision into the future that he possessed, the foresight that he possessed. He was a extraordinary man in terms of like political and military skill. As an orator, he gave the people what he wanted to do. He was one of those type of persons.
So why did he decide in the middle of all this that a huge building project was so important to the way that Athens would present itself to the world?
Well, it was propaganda in a sense. The Athenians were the cultural center. It was also piety to the gods too, piety to Athena. It was glorifying the city. He was taking the money from the empire and putting it into making the city appear more glorious and grand. In addition to what he did on top of the Acropolis, as we mentioned, he erected the temple to Hephaestus. That's on the hill on the northwest side of the Agora, I believe it is.
Is that the one
It's the side facing the Acropolis. It's so when you enter, it's directly to your right.
But it's the one that's kind of like by itself. It's like it's across it's like you have the Acropolis and then there's the Agora and then it's kind of on the other side of the Agora.
Yeah, it's one of the most preserved temples in all of ancient Greek history because of its history. It was turned into a church, and it just like the Parthenon, both of those were turned into churches, and because of it, they were preserved. I mean, preserved in the sense that they're still together and not preserved and like everything's still inside. Obviously, there were changes that were made to turn it from a pagan temple into a Christian church and then into a mosque and then back into a church. I mean, the Parthenon would have been as preserved as the Temple of Hephaestus if it wasn't for a little gunpowder incident, which I'm sure we'll get to here shortly. Yeah, that's actually remarkably, it's one of my favorite temples there, the Temple of Hephaestus. It was originally thought to be dedicated to Theseus during the Middle Ages because of some inscriptions, but scholarship now and the predominant belief is that it was to Hephaestus because it was up there in the hill where a lot of the artisans worked, and Hephaestus was the god of the artisans, masonry and the foundry and that sort of stuff. So they believe that it was dedicated to him. There was also some stuff to Athena in there as well, and Heracles, a little like some cult areas inside, but predominantly it was a temple to Hephaestus.
So he starts building all of these projects. A lot of times you have a politician who's a builder politician come in and things get completed, after they're gone or slowly over time. Did he see most of these things in his lifetime?
No. So the Parthenon was finished before the war. Most of the stuff did not finish because of the war. So the Parthenon took up a lot of the time and effort, and it was an expensive endeavor. The Erechtheion and the Propylaea and the Temple of Athena and Nike weren't finished until later.
And the Erechtheion is the one that has all of the caryatids that people see. So it's the one with like 4 or 5 statues of women all in a row. And I feel like it's one of the things that my friends who go to Greece Instagram the most is the caryatid women. They're so beautiful too. I have a bunch of photos of it. I got to dig off of a camera.
Oh yeah, it's one of the oddest shaped temples in all of Greek history, simply because it incorporated so many different. It actually had the cult of Athena. It was housed in there. It wasn't actually in the Parthenon.
Oh really?
The Parthenon was more of a treasury and propaganda machine. More than anything, the actual cult statue of Athena was housed in the Erechtheion, the original cult, the wooden statue from the archaic period, the supposed olive tree, the place where Poseidon struck his trident was supposed to be in the Erechtheion as well. That was like the sacred religious building. The Parthenon was the treasury. There was the statue of Athena, but there's a lot of scholarship over it. Like, why is there such an extravagant building that didn't even have a religious function? And some people argue it did, while most people argue it doesn't. But the fact that the cult statue was in the Erechtheion is, to me, is clear indication that it was a building of grandeur and propaganda. And then you see all the glory of Athens, so to speak, and it has the treasury.
That's so interesting. I don't know if I knew that, because I'm going to say something that might sound weird. I've been to the fake little Parthenon in Nashville where they like reconstructed it. When you think of the Acropolis, you think of the Parthenon, and having been there twice, I don't know if it ever entered my head that the Parthenon is not the most important building on the Acropolis. And now I feel super dumb, but that's part of why I love doing this and talking to people that know more than me about these places.
Well, first off, the Nashville one is really awesome. I've been there twice now. It's really cool because you get to see it. I mean, obviously it's not the same 100%, but it doesn't have the same magnificence as it would if it were sitting on the Acropolis, because you're in this beautiful park, but you're not like elevated. It's not mystique sort of thing. But it is painted a little bit, even though it would have been different colors, multiple more colors in the ancient world, but at least you see some sort of red paints and things like that, and it does give you a sense of, oh, there's a temple that has color. That's how it actually would have looked like back then, in a sense.
So for people that don't know what we're talking about, because I feel like this is a place that like only locals or history buffs really know about, there is a reconstructed Parthenon in Greater Nashville that actually it has the statue in it, I think, right? Or it's supposed to feel more like what the real place would have looked like at the time than it looks like now, because it's a reconstruction of it more in its heyday. It's a cool place to go if you love history. I just don't think people know that it's really there. So go to Nashville and go to the fake Parthenon if you can't get to Athens.
Yeah, definitely.
I want to pause for a moment to talk about our sponsor, Audible. For you, the listeners of the History Fangirl podcast, Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a free 30-day trial to give you the opportunity to check out their service. For today's episode, I want to recommend the Great Courses lecture series entitled The Age of Pericles. If you want to get deeper into the man, the politics, and the culture of the world that he lived in, this course is 24 different lectures that cover all aspects of this specific time in Athenian history. To download your free audiobook, go to audibletrial.com/historyfangirl. Again, that's audibletrial.com/historyfangirl for your free audiobook.
So back to what we were talking about earlier. So in regards to the Parthenon, so they have the inner Ionic frieze and the outer Doric frieze, and it's one of those cool things. We can get into that with the metopes and the images of the sculpture reliefs. But the inner Ionic frieze would have been very, very, even though it's elaborate, it would have been very hard to see. And you can study it now because the reliefs are all hanging at eye level in the museums, either the Acropolis or the British. That's another subject. You can see them sitting at eye level, but the Acropolis, it would have been about 40 feet high. And they would have been, although they were painted, it would have been dark and shadowy, and it would have been extremely difficult to see. So the question a lot of people ask is, why did Phidias even bother to put very expensive decoration that you wouldn't normally find on a temple in a place that was very hard to see? And then there's another part of the evidence is there's been no altar or for sacrifice found at the Parthenon as well, which is, if it was its cult center, there would have been one of those sitting on the outside. And that's not to say that one didn't exist, but there's no evidence that it's there right now. There's no markings on stones or foundations or any of that sort of stuff. Because it's important, because the altar was where all the sacrifices took place. And you don't have any records of personnel who worked in the Parthenon. You would expect to hear things about priestesses, but we don't have any evidence of any priestesses that operated in the temple. And so when you combine all of this with the fact that Phidias created this massive statue of Athena Parthenos, which is where we get the name Parthenon. Parthenos is virgin, so it's Athena the virgin, or maiden, I guess, if you want to, the maiden or the virgin. So it's because Athena is a virgin goddess. So when you combine all that with a massive statue, it didn't even serve as the cult statue. So it's like, so one of the main questions a lot of people ask is, what's the actual function if it wasn't religious then? And so it was very clearly ostentatious. It was an expensive, expensive temple. We have some inscriptions about how much it cost. They used some of the finest materials. Instead of the typical Parion marble, where they got from the island of Paros, the Athenians used this super white Pentelic marble from Mount Pentelicos, which is about 10 miles from Athens. I'm an American. I'm not sure how many kilometers that is off the top of my head. And then the accounts show that the transportation of it was the largest single expense for its entire construction. The construction cost in total 469 talents. So a talent, not to confuse people, is divided into 60 mina, and a mina could be divided into 100 drachma. So basically, it was 2,814,000 drachma to build this structure. And so if you take into consideration that a drachma was approximately one day's wage for an average ancient Greek worker, so that's 2,814,000 average day wages for just the Parthenon alone.
Oh, wow.
So as a state project, this was a colossally expensive undertaking, and it was one of the most expensive temples ever built in history.
It's got to be one of, if not the most famous building in history, one of the top 5 most famous buildings in history. So they probably got their money's worth, but I can imagine that would be an outrageous expense for some people in the day. Or was Athens just so prosperous right at that moment that people weren't really paying attention?
People were paying attention, like I mentioned earlier. Some of the conservatives said that Pericles was decking it out like some high-class hetairai and things like that. People knew what was going on. Some people didn't care. Some people did. There was a ostracism of Thucydides, not the historian. One of the things with Greek history is people have the same name. So you have to make sure you're not – you have to make sure that they're not getting confused. He was one of the conservative faction, and he ended up getting ostracized, which means in the Athenian democracy you get if 6,000 citizens voted for you, wrote your name, there was an ostracism every year. If 6,000 citizens voted in total, the majority winner would lose his citizenship status for 10 years. He was basically exiled from Athenian territory. He didn't lose his money. He didn't lose his wealth. He didn't lose – in 10 years, he could come back, and it was as if he was frozen in time. Nothing had happened. It was kind of their way to day out tyranny. If anyone was kind of coming at like as a dictator or tyrannical behavior or doing things more than they should be, they were – attacked by their political enemies in that sort of sense. But it was very dangerous though to do it as a political attack, because you never know which way it was going to go. You can try and get yourself ostracized, or you can try and get one of your enemies ostracized and end up getting yourself ostracized in the process. One of the very fascinating things about Pericles is that he was able to not come off seen as some sort of tyrant or some sort of like in that sense, and he was able to keep the people on his side where he was never in fear of ostracism, like Themistocles was, Aristides, Cimon, even his father was ostracized. We have all sorts of ostraca found in the Agora with people's names on it. Some of the famous ones is of Themistocles. That's sitting in the Agora Museum. So Thucydides, not the historian, got ostracized in 444 BC. And so we can tell that there were people, based upon that and Plutarch, there were people that didn't like what was going on, especially the conservative faction. But they weren't in the power. By that point, Pericles had the democracy basically in his hand. And I like this analogy. I heard it somewhere. I think it was a previous professor. I can't really remember who to give them credit. But they said that Pericles held the beating heart of democracy in the palm of his hand, and he knew which strings to pull to get the people to do as he pleased. So the Parthenon finished in 432 BC. It started in 447 BC, and it finished in 432 BC. And then there was the Acropolis, which was the big gateway, that like the famous gateway up into the Acropolis. And that started in 437, and that also finished in 432, but it was never completed. But work stopped in 432 BC because of the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War, which a few of the other buildings were the same way. The Erechtheion, the Temple of Athena Nike, and the Hephaestion, or the Temple of Hephaestus, all started, and then they were stopped, and then there was periods of where they kind of worked at it during the war, but they didn't. Like, they kept with it, but they didn't, like, they half-heartedly kept with it. Their attentions were focused elsewhere. There was a period of peace in the late 420s that allowed them to finish the Temple of Athena Nike, and then the Erechtheion finished sometime between 409 and 406 BC. So this was most of the temples outside of the Parthenon would have been after Pericles died.
before we go and talk about what happened afterwards, real quick, what do we know about the people who were the actual builders of these buildings? What was their, their economic status? Who were
So
they?
a lot of the construction workers would have been the artisans, like I mentioned earlier with the Temple of Hephaestus, a lot of the foundry workers. Some of them would have been slaves, but most of them would have been what we would call medics. The Greek word is metoikoi, and they basically would be non-resident aliens. Some of them can get quite wealthy, but they didn't have Athenian status. And so to backtrack a little bit, there was an influx of medics a century earlier that came, or foreigners that came into Athens during the time of Solon and after. They did this push to get more people with technical skills, kind of like how the whole rave nowadays is like immigration, like if you have a skill, we'll take you, but if you don't, we don't want you, sort of thing.
Yeah.
It's kind of like that. Like if you have some sort of skill, you'll come, we can give you citizenship, you do that sort of stuff. So you got a lot of people flocked to Athens in the 6th century BC. You got a lot of poets from the other islands. You got a lot of artisan workers, things like that. And then Pericles made it so that Athenian citizenship could only be achieved if you had a mother and a father who were both Athenian, which ironically enough would come back to bite him at the end of his life because he didn't have an heir of his own, and he had this mistress named Aspasia. She's a courtesan, one of those Hetairai, that he had a son to, and he basically cried and begged to the Athenian people to allow him to become a citizen. So it was basically like the ultimate of irony, which they did. They loved him, so they let it, but it's just irony. Life is funny sometimes.
Yeah.
So a lot of the people, there would have been some slaves. From my understanding, there's not a whole lot on the actual information of who worked there. We just know how much money was put into it on the accounts, but we can kind of guess based upon who was actually working on things in Attica at that time. So a lot of the state-owned slaves worked in the mines and the quarries. There was also artisans who were getting paid to do that. They would have been the lower class of Athenian society. Actually, they wouldn't even really been a class. There would have been some citizens who were in that. They would have been the thetes, but most of the middle and upper classes would not have been involved in this. We do have some of the famous painters and things like that who, a few of them were outsiders who were given citizenship for the work they did, like Polygnitus. He was very famous, although none of his paintings have survived, but he famously painted in the Propylaea, which had the main entrance. It had this wing called the Pinacotheca, which was in the northwest wing, and it was basically like a picture gallery and a banquet room and a rest area. So kind of like when you're making an entrance from the Agora up the slope of the Acropolis up into the top of the Acropolis, there was a lot of paintings. The northwest wing took you to the gallery. The southwest wing would have taken you up to the Temple of Athena Nike. So Polygnitus he had a bunch of famous paintings up there, and he was given citizenship. So basically, to circle back around, we don't know specifically where all the workers came from. We could just make best guesses, saying that they were basically either the lower classes or they were foreigners, people of great skill who were from other cities who were brought in by Pericles to work. So that sort of stuff, either as the architects or the painters or the sculptors.
Okay, so we can kind of reconstruct it, but we don't have any of their origin. I mean, I know that's really common for most of ancient history. We don't have anything from just a regular person that survived, or even somebody who knew of a regular person that survived.
Yeah, there's no accounts. They weren't built by aliens or Hebrew slaves, like the pyramid.
Oh, is that like a big thing?
No.
Oh, yeah.
Like people take a guess on the pyramids and like, oh, this is how this was built, and like we have theories about it, but they're still theories, and we have no conclusive proof either way. I mean, that's how most ancient history is, to be honest. There is very little that I've come across in my 55 or so episodes or so where you can find 100% this is what everybody says in the field, and this is what every ancient source says about anything. It's one of the things that is infuriating but fascinating at the same time. You're piecing things together, so at the end of the day, ancient history is educated guesswork, and what makes logical sense and what doesn't make sense, and which you can exclude. and then new evidence will come up, and you'll be like, oh, okay, so this theory, which we thought for 30 years, obviously is now wrong.
So once this time period of Greece is over and Athens is no longer the center of political power in the region, what happened to the Acropolis? I know from going to the Acropolis Museum and from being there how angry still some people in modern Greece are about the things that happened over the 2 millennia since the fall of not the fall of Athens, but the end of really the classical period of Athens through independence of Greece. But it's just kind of share with our listeners a little bit of the overview of some of the highlights.
Yeah. So after the Peloponnesian War, there was a decade or so where Athens came back to political power, and Thebes, and then Sparta. It was the war of the hegemony. But for all intents and purposes, Athens stopped being the political power of Greece, and they reverted to simply the cultural power. And over time, the Acropolis, and more specifically the Parthenon, became this symbol of Athenian identity and superiority. And so every time that Athens was attacked, the Parthenon too was targeted, and the Acropolis too was targeted. So, for instance, when the Roman general Sulla attacked Athens and laid siege to the Athens, there was a lot of damage to the area around the Agora. They didn't quite make it to the Acropolis because people used it as for defense. But Sulla attacked Athens when it became under Roman control, especially in some of the buildings were retuned, like upkeep. And then there was buildings added into the Agora. But a lot of the damage that we have, most of the damage initially started, for the Parthenon specifically, it was burned pretty bad in the 3rd century AD, or CE, whichever you prefer to use, by Germanic tribes. They're Heruli. So it resulted in the roof collapsing. And at that point, the roof was timber still. Like it had the marble outside and stuff, but the roof was still timber. And had a lot of damage to the interior. So then they made a lot of repairs to the Parthenon in the following century, especially during the reign of the Emperor Julian, called Julian the Apostate. He was the last great pagan emperor. So this was after Constantine. So at this point, a lot of the pagan sanctuaries kind of I don't want to say they fell to the wayside, but as the empire became more Christian, they kind of stopped getting the imperial money to fix it. And then you see at some point in the late 4th, early 5th, you see Theodosius II decreed that all pagan temples in the empire were to be closed and shut down. And it was probably at this point that the great cult statue that we mentioned earlier, the one that made by Phidias that stood in the Parthenon, was probably looted and taken back to Constantinople. We don't really know. It's lost, but it's believed that it was taken back to Constantinople and destroyed 5 centuries later during one of the many attacks on the city, on Constantinople, that is. And then during the Byzantine era, many people lived on the Acropolis. They just began to live on there because it was easily defended, and the Agora kind of was destroyed. It was kind of shrank. The entire city kind of shrank, as the cities tended to do in the Middle Ages. Rome did the same thing. And so at some point, the result of this was that in the late 6th century, so we're talking like the late 500s, it was converted to an Eastern Orthodox Christian church. It was dedicated to Parthenos Maria, or the Virgin Mary. The Virgin Athena, the Virgin Mary, they made that connection. So, and this was a very common practice with a lot of ancient religious buildings, this continuity of use. And basically when a building or an area or a site was designated as being sacred by the Greco-Romans, it stayed sacred even when the religion changes. And this happened quite a lot with Greco-Roman temples, as we see with a lot of them throughout the Greco-Roman world.
Yeah, even the Pantheon. So the Parthenon in Greece was turned into a church, but the Pantheon in Rome was turned into a church. It might still technically be designated a church.
I think it is actually. I don't remember either, but yeah, it's the exact same. So, and of course, alterations were made. The Byzantine Greeks, for example, the entrance was usually the east side on the Acropolis, on the Parthenon on the Acropolis, and they moved it to the west side. And then the temple's internal spaces was altered, and they added different walls and doorways, apses. Because the prototypical pagan ancient Greek temple was a lot different than what would be inside of a church where people would come in and commune and sort of stuff like that. Whereas in the ancient Greek temple, there wasn't like a congregation where modern churches are now. Most of the sacrifice took place out on the altar, and very few people actually came outside of the priest.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
There wasn't like worshiping inside.
Okay.
They had the sacrifice outside the temples. People could walk up onto the steps, but there was very little, especially in the sacred area where the gods supposedly came. They like didn't live there. They weren't there 100% of the time, but that was their area. It was their home, one of their homes, so to speak.
Well, like how Apollo lived at Delphi, which is something I want to talk to you about down the road. So Athena lived in the Parthenon, they believed, or did they believe she lived somewhere else?
Well, they thought that was her home, but of course she was always out and about, sort of, so to speak. So like people can have multiple homes, especially a god.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was like the sacred space of Athena. So anyway, yes, they made a lot of alterations inside. They also lined the inside of it with a lot of Byzantine icons, Christian theme icons. You can still see a lot of Christian inscriptions carved onto the columns inside. Actually, one of the things I forgot to mention, so when I was a student in Athens, one of the really cool things was the professor that I had connections with the American School of Classical Studies, who's in charge of the excavations there. And we got to walk inside of the Acropolis and view everything. And we actually like went up the stepways and inside the Acropolis. We walked up the medieval bell tower, which we'll talk about shortly, that came later. But we got to see a lot of the inside of so that was really cool. Like
That's
really,
amazing. Really
cool. Yeah, it was really, really cool. So I got to see some of these inscriptions on the columns, which is where I'm getting off on this digression. So nude statues at this point were either removed or destroyed or reinterpreted according to a Christian theme. So the Acropolis was this massive ancient Greek center. It was the center of their culture. Like it was like the civic identity. So the result was that in the Byzantine Empire, it also became an important Christian pilgrimage site for a lot of people in the area as well. It took up the same amount of importance to the Christian Byzantine Empire as it did. Well, I don't want to say the same importance because there was the Hagia Sophia and there was other things that were massive as well, whereas the Acropolis was the thing. It was still a big deal during the Christian era, the Byzantine era.
So the Byzantines come in. Then the Byzantines fall to the Ottoman Empire.
The Byzantines actually, during the Crusades, it came under the Latin occupation.
Oh.
And it got turned into a Roman Catholic Cathedral of Our Lady. So it was, the Acropolis came under Latin occupation. And it was during this tower when the watchtower and the spiral staircase were all constructed in the southwest corner and stuff that I talked about where I walked up. You can actually see, we'll get to this shortly, but you could actually see in this tower, you could actually see cannonball marks.
Yeah.
It's really cool. I have a lot of cool pictures from that.
Send them to me and I'll put them on the blog post for this episode.
Okay.
And that way people can go. So the link will be in the show notes. You can go see the pictures, Ryan's pictures from inside. You can also enter this week's contest because, which I'll tell more about later.
So the Latin occupation didn't last super long. I'm going to say it was the 13th century, but don't hold me to that specifically. But it didn't last super long. Eventually, it might have been the 14th. It might have been the 13th and the 14th century. Eventually, Athens was conquered in the 15th century by the Ottomans, the Ottoman Turks. And at that point, it was converted into a mosque. And by this point, the Acropolis was completely covered with houses and it was fortified. You know, you've seen in Greece, you've seen a lot of those fortifications from during the Middle Ages. It was completely fortified at this point as a citadel, military stronghold with houses and stuff, like kind of like a barracks, so to speak. But despite all of these alterations and all of these various religious conversions, the structural integrity of the Parthenon basically remained intact. It was the same size. It wasn't significantly changed exteriorly. It was the outside it was the inside that was changed dramatically. So one of the things that's really beneficial nowadays is in 1674, I think it was, 1674, there was a Frenchman, and I'm going to butcher his name because my French is terrible, called Jacques Carry. He visited Athens and he made all these different cool drawings of the Parthenon, its pediment, and its friezes, which is very fortuitous because 13 years later, and had to do the math in my head. I know it was 13 years. So 13 years later, it was in 1687. I know that this date is correct. During the Second Turkish-Venetian War, the mosque was used to store gunpowder. I don't know why, but I guess they believed that the Venetians wouldn't target a building of like such historic and religious importance. Well, they were wrong. And the Venetians shot cannonballs at the Turks up to the Acropolis, and they made direct contact and set off this huge explosion that destroyed the entire central portion, including 40 feet from the eastern pediment. And so a lot of the Parthenon was found like a mile away.
Oh, wow.
Parts of the Parthenon were found like a mile away. It just blew up the entire center. 6 columns from the south fell. I believe it was 8 from the north. And the entire eastern porch was basically just shut. It was just knocked over. And so then to make matters worse, when the Venetians were able to gain control of the Acropolis, their commander, Morosini, then tried to extract a loot from the ruins. We'll just put it that way. So he tried to remove the sculptures of the western pediment, and the pulley system that he was using snapped and crashed everything to the ground and destroyed it all. That's basically it. Everything got destroyed at this point. And then when the Turks were able to recapture the Acropolis, then a small mosque was built inside the ruined temple. I want to say it was 1708 or something. Yeah, 1708. And then the rest of the stone was then a lot of the stone was then looted and used for military use because it was destroyed at this point. So it's like no point in preserving it. That's why like when they're doing restorations now, not all the stone is still there. Like they're still using it from Mount Penteli, but if they're using modern versions of the stone, not the old stuff. Basically, 18th century saw Ottoman stagnation in control of all of their regions. And eventually you would see in the 19th century the Greek War of Independence, and they would overthrow them. But one of the major things was in the 18th century, you saw this rise of Philhellenism, like this love of Greek things. A lot of archaeological discoveries were made, and you saw a lot of Germans, British, and French coming across a lot of a lot of temples and things like that. That's how you get a lot of the stuff that's in the current museums. That's outside of Greece. So specifically, one of the contentious events took place in 1801 when Lord Elgin, he was the British ambassador to Istanbul, obtained questionable permission from the Ottoman Sultan. We'll just put it that way. I'm not going to get into the controversy. I'm not going to take one way or the other. Basically, he got permission to make casts and drawings on the Acropolis. So he removed a bunch of the sculptures and many of the statues and frieze reliefs and shipped them back to London. And they were eventually sold to the British Museum in 1816. And now where they reside now, and they're known as the Elgin Marbles by the British and the Parthenon Marbles by the Greeks.
And the Greeks really are not happy.
Yeah, this is we'll get to that. So basically, the Greeks won their independence in 1832, so very shortly after that. And like we were mentioning earlier, soon all of the medieval and Ottoman buildings in the Acropolis were completely destroyed. And the Acropolis became a heritage site in 1854, I believe it was. It was in the mid-1850s once they, I guess, got rid of all the medieval and Ottoman buildings and back to its classical Greek roots. So the main part of the controversy is the British Museum argues that Elgin had legal title to them. He received them from the Turks who were occupying Greece at that time. And that by housing them in their museum, they were able to preserve them from acid rain and air pollution and all that sort of stuff that affects modern-day Athens right now, as well as looters and private collectors and, random pot shots from soldiers. You know how it is. So basically they argue they preserved them. And they also now argue that they are now part of British heritage, and returning them would send some sort of dangerous precedent that would result in the stripping of the galleries of many of the other major museums. And the Greeks are basically arguing that the Turks had no moral authorization to sell the sculptures that didn't belong to them, and that the Lord Elgin caused structural damage to the Parthenon when he removed them, and now they have the new Acropolis Museum in which to house them, which I believe opened in 2009.
It's really cool. I really love it.
So just to go off on a sidetrack, since I was a student, I got into all the museums and sites for free that summer. So I was at the Acropolis at least a dozen times, and the National Archaeological Museum and the Acropolis Museum probably eight times each or so.
Oh, that's amazing.
When I wasn't like traveling to other places that I hadn't seen, I probably would have went more. I usually stopped in for like an hour on the afternoons after class just to look at something else. I didn't like go through a full tour or anything, but like it was cool. Like I love doing that. It was so much fun. And I mean, I could get in for free with a student ID because I got an ID because I was technically a student there, even though I was, yeah. Anyway, so that was an aside. So unfortunately, I didn't have to pay 40 euros like you did.
The Acropolis is expensive. The Acropolis is like 20 or 25, and then the museum is like I think 10 or 15. I was definitely envious of anyone I saw having like a student pass on any of the tours because Greece is not cheap. Greece is a cheap place to travel compared to Western Europe, but they really do make you pay if you want to get into their heritage sites.
I tell everyone who's college age now that like I talk to on the podcast, on Twitter or anything, if you get the opportunity, travel abroad because you can do so much thing. Like it's so much cheaper to see things. You don't have any responsibilities right now. You can go travel. I mean, you can travel later, but like you're a student, so things are going to be a lot cheaper.
Yeah. And your standard of living is lower typically. So like I hate sharing hostel dorms. Mm-hmm. So I like usually will swing for a single. And luckily because of what I do, a lot of times I get to try out cool hotels and tell other people about them and not have to pay the full price, which it's like, yep. But I also live in hotels. So
when I was in Greece, since I was a student, it wasn't near as expensive. Italy was so expensive for me. Italy was a lot of expensive. We can talk about this later, but I found a lot more cheaper options in Greece. It is, like you said, it's one of the cheaper European hotspots. We were talking about the Acropolis Museum. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sidetracks sometimes are fun. So I mentioned it. So yeah, the Acropolis Museum is awesome. So that was the main argument now is, well, we have this museum. Why can't we house them? Sort of thing. I fall more in the line of they should be back in Greece, but we're not gonna get quite make that quite contentious here. I see the viewpoint from both sides. Selfishly, I got to see a lot of cool things living in America that I would have never seen because they're in the Met or the Getty Villa, not back in Greece.
I feel the exact same way.
But at the same time, I understand why you would want your heritage back where it belongs, especially to complete a collection. So it's not tricky, and I'm an outsider, so I don't try and butt into these conversations when people have them on Twitter or whatever.
Well, that's part of why I wanted to do this podcast. It's one of the things that Mike Duncan and I talked about when we were talking about the Forum versus the Acropolis. You know, I was very lucky in that not only did I grow up in America, but I grew up in a family that could afford to travel and a school district that could afford for students to go on mm-hmm. trips. And that's, you know, a small subset of the world gets to go into these museums and see things. And I was very lucky. I remember the first time I saw ancient coins from other countries. I was in high school and I was so wowed by it. It was in the Art Institute of Chicago. And I'm not saying the Art Institute of Chicago. I don't know anything about the provenance of what I saw that day. But I was very lucky, right? And I was so privileged. But those coins do not belong to Americans. They're not American coins. And there are some things, it's like some countries have so much stuff, it's not a huge deal if some of it is like around the world. But part of why I wanted to do this podcast is the Elgin marbles might not be in Greece, but there might be a replica of the Parthenon in Nashville, but there's only really one Acropolis, and people who have the means should mm-hmm. go and see it and know about the place because that place can't be taken away from the people, even if the stuff
Yeah, can. Exactly. Speaking of coins, I love coins too. Did you go to see the numismatic museum when you were in Athens?
No, I didn't.
Next time you go to Athens, check that out. It's where Heinrich Schliemann's old mansion was. It's inside of his mansion.
Oh,
it's just this. It's awesome. I discovered it like one of my last few weeks in Athens. I didn't even know about it.
Just that it's Howard Schliemann who is. I talked about him a lot when I talked with Professor Bennett about mm-hmm. Mycenae because we were talking about Howard Schliemann excavated Mycenae, and Howard Schliemann is one of those figures that he is a really interesting person, and he is in the middle of a lot of these conversations about what should be where in what country and what was lost. And And, he did a lot of good and he did a lot of interesting things that maybe weren't so great. And so just going to his house sounds really cool.
Yeah, it was, there's a lot of cool, like, I don't want to say not popular, but not as big as the main museums in Athens that I found equally as fascinating. Like the Museum of Cyclotic Art, the Byzantine Museum, I really, really enjoyed.
I loved the Byzantine Museum so much.
And that's not most people who go there for 3 or 4 days, they don't see that.
So now that we have the Acropolis Museum and people are I feel like Greece is kind of resurgent in tourism right now. And what would be some other things that you think people should see or that you would want them to notice on the Acropolis that maybe they wouldn't know to look for?
When you first enter the Propylaea, to your right, there is a bunch of stone, just random stones all over the place. And there were other sanctuaries there. It wasn't just Athena on there, and it wasn't just Poseidon, as we mentioned earlier. There was a sanctuary there to Artemis. It was called the Browronian, so Artemis of Browron. So you can see the stones. I mean, it's not as cool looking because it's not standing up, but there's a sanctuary there. There was also the Holcatheke, which literally is like the bronze storeroom. It's where they held all the dedicatory offerings. That was right near there as well, and that's no longer there. There was a ton of different buildings. So there was the Pandrosion, which was a sanctuary dedicated to Pandrosus, which is she was a daughter of Kekrops. So this was between the Erechtheion and the Temple of Athena, the old Temple of Athena Polius, which is the cult center. So Kekrops was one of the first kings of Athens. He was this mythical king who was supposedly the king when Athena and Poseidon had the contest. He was a snake creature. So interesting aside, the Athenians argued that they were autochthonous, meaning that they were born from the ground. Their first king was Kekrops. So there's weird myth and kind of kinky myth where Hephaestus lusted after Athena, and he hadn't. Is this PG?
Yeah. No, it's not.
He hadn't had sex in a while because Aphrodite, his wife, had been hooking up with other people, mainly Ares. And so he prematurely ejaculated as he went after Athena, and his semen hit the ground and with Gaia, Mother Earth, and it created this Kekrops creature, or it created this creature, snake-like creatures that started the line of Athenian kings. And there's some weird myths at the beginning of in Greek mythology, which is equally fascinating, and you can tell that they were structured later during the classical time to push back this nationalistic fervor from the Athenians, like, oh, we've always been at this people, or we've always been at this place, we're coming from the gods, that sort of stuff. Anyway, so there was a sanctuary to him and his daughter. There were sanctuaries to some of the other legendary kings as well, especially in the back. So when you come on top of the Acropolis, when you come through the Propylaea, the entrance, you see the Parthenon in front of you, and behind it is where the old Acropolis Museum used to be before they moved it down to where the new one is. It's in the southeast corner. So there's some sanctuaries back there as well to other kings. There's also a temple to Augustus built up there during the Roman period. So there's a bunch of other temples and stuff up there.
So Ryan, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. It's also been really fun just meeting I've met so many people through this, but you were one of the first people that I met after I launched. So thank you so much for reaching out to me. Do you want to tell people a little bit about where they can find you?
You're welcome. It's my pleasure. I enjoyed this so much, and I am enjoying listening to some of your interviews. In order to reach out to me, you can find me on, the website is thehistoryofancientgreece.com. I'm also on Twitter at Greek History Pod, and there's also a Facebook page called The History of Ancient Greece. I believe it's the History of Ancient Greece podcast.
We'll put a link in the show notes to your website and to your Facebook page and your Twitter account so people can find you and connect with you. And I really wish that I knew your podcast existed before I was in Greece. And I know that I will go back. So I'm really excited now to catch up on all of your back episodes. So if people haven't started yet, he's at like episode 50 something. So it's a good time to get started. You don't get too behind. I want to say thank you again to Ryan Stitt from the History of Ancient Greece podcast for coming on the show and sharing his love of the Acropolis and Athens with us. Definitely follow the link in the show notes to check out his behind-the-scenes pictures from inside the Acropolis. And if you want to learn even more about ancient Greek history, check out his podcast because it's amazing. For those who have subscribed to the show already, thank you. If you want more episodes, please subscribe in iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you would take a moment to rate and review the show, it helps tremendously with helping others find the podcast. We have been live for exactly 1 month, and we just hit our 30th review internationally. So I really thank you to everyone who left a review so far. And if you're listening to this episode, please take a moment to rate and review. It really, really helps. The prize for this week's giveaway is a $20 Amazon gift card. If you'd like to enter, follow the link in the show notes to the blog post on my website, historyfangirl.com. All you have to do to enter is be a newsletter subscriber and leave a comment on that post. Good luck!